Howard Gardner spoke to an audience of 675 parents, educators, social service professionals, and community members on Tuesday evening, October 30th, 2012 in Cornog Auditorium on New Trier High School's campus in Northfield, Illinois. He spoke on Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, Educating for the Virtues in the Age of Truthiness and Twitter, based on his book with that title. More information about Dr. Gardner is available at www.howardgardner.com and at www.goodworkproject.org. The event was sponsored by Family Action Network, New Trier High School Parents Association, Kenilworth School District 38, Sunset Ridge School District 29, Winnetka School District 36, North Shore Country Day School, and FAN's corporate sponsors, Compass Health Center, North Shore Community Bank, Quintessential New Trier, and the Bookstall at Chestnut Court, and by FAN's base of support through the parent-teacher organizations in the schools of New Trier Township and dozens of volunteers. No commercial use of this recording is permitted. More information about the event is available at the Family Action Network website, www.familyactionnetwork.net. Now to the introduction of Howard Gardner and his talk.
Nearly 3 years ago to this exact day, I had the distinct pleasure of introducing Howard Gardner for a talk on what was his newest book at the time, 5 Minds for the Future. That book was a policy statement that argued for 5 minds: the disciplined mind, the creative mind, the synthesizing mind, the respectful mind, and the ethical mind, that need to be cultivated in academia and the business world in order to be successful in the future. And after the last few days, I might add the wise mind and the calm mind. His latest book, the subject of tonight's lecture, calls on us to examine the type of messages being transmitted to youth today about success, ambition, competition, and ethics. I recall a concept that Brene Brown spoke about a few weeks ago, the scarcity model of consumption. We perceive the world to not have enough to go around. Not enough slots on the sports team, not high enough academic scores and grades, not enough service work, not enough freshman slots at top schools, and not enough positions at top firms upon graduation. And to counter all of that not enough, all those stats and numbers, there's the not enough of not smart enough, nice enough, pretty enough, thin enough, happy enough, or popular enough. To call it a rat race is almost too benign a term for the allostatic load our culture thrusts upon its kids, and more troubling that they take upon themselves. And so we gape at cheating scandals and risk behaviors and the crash culture of celebrity. We wonder how our own child will thread the needle in this climate. I wonder how I thread the needle. Howard will offer the beginnings of a way out with his call for the creation of a commons where issues can be discussed and examined. FAN tries to create such a commons with every program, like tonight's. Howard Gardner is the Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also holds positions as Adjunct Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and Senior Director of Harvard's Project Zero. Among numerous honors, Dr. Gardner received a MacArthur Prize Fellowship in 1981. He has received honorary degrees from 29 colleges and universities. In 2005 and again in 2008, he was selected by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines as one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. Most recently, Dr. Gardner received the 2011 Prince of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. The author of 28 books, 29? Translated into 32 languages and several hundred articles, he is perhaps best known in educational circles for his theory of multiple intelligences. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friend, Dr. Howard Gardner.
Thanks, first of all, to all of you for coming out this evening. I like to have an audience. And I have to admit, after trying to get out here for 2 days, it makes me feel welcome to see so many of you here. I want to thank Linda Yankee and the district for welcoming me and welcoming us. And thank Lonnie Stanich. And can you hear me? Yeah. Lonnie wanted to make sure you heard when I said her name. I want to thank Lonnie and the fan network, dozens of people who work voluntarily as volunteers to bring interesting programs here to the Chicago area. FAN stands for Family Action Network, but most of you probably don't know that the family here includes Lonnie's husband Eric and her son Eno, both of whom are real partners with them in orchestrating very complicated programs. And Lonnie always wants to get time with me to find out whom she should invite, but everybody who I mention she's already invited, and then she tells me people I haven't heard of, and then I have to go and watch their TED Talks or read their books. So it's the symmetry isn't quite the way one might imagine. But as she said, on the eve of Halloween, I am going to talk about my most recent book, the title of which is up here. And when I had my 50th high school reunion a year or two ago, I went back to the secondary school which I'd attended, called Wyoming Seminary. It's in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I was showing my wife around the campus, the gym and the library, and then we went into a chemistry class, and she said, "Look." And I said, "Oh, what should I look at?" And there on the wall it said, "Verum pulchrum bonum." Now, even if your Latin isn't particularly good, you probably can guess that this means truth, beauty, and goodness. If you had asked me, did my high school have a motto, I would have said no. And if you'd said to me, it had one, and you just don't remember it, would have said, you got to be kidding. But in fact, this was my high school motto. I had absolutely erased it from my memory, but obviously not from my unconscious, because 50 years later, I wrote a book with those words in the title. So if you are a parent of a student here in secondary school or happen to be a student yourself, even if you think you aren't processing it, you are, and it comes back to haunt you a half a century later. But this is also a tale of two other books. This is one of them. It's called Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres by Henry Adams, who was a American historian and member of the Adams family. This is Adams family with one D, not two Ds. And the second book is a book called Reality Hunger by a man named David Shields. Now, the Henry Adams book was written and published privately over 100 years ago, and it's not much read. But the book was important for me because Henry Adams worshipped the Middle Ages. And for him, the epitome of the Middle Ages were the magnificent Gothic cathedrals in Europe. And he saw these cathedrals and the whole medieval era as a time when the classical virtues were united as if they were one. So here's a quotation from that book. Henry Adams writes, "The whole mount still kept the grand style. It expressed the unity of church and state, God and man, peace and war, life and death, good and bad. It solved the whole problem of the universe. God reconciles all. The world is an evident, obvious, sacred harmony." So how does this text relate to my topic of truth, beauty, and goodness? For Henry Adams, the definitions of those were unproblematic. They were all the same. They were all good. They were all united. Truth equals beauty equals goodness. End of discussion. The other book came out in 2010. It's also not particularly well known, though maybe I sold a few copies of it. It's by a self-styled postmodernist named David Shields. The book's a bit more difficult to describe. It's got 26 chapters. Each one is a different letter, A, B, C, all the way to Z. The book consists of 618 squibs, ranging from a few words to a few sentences to a page. And as you read through the book, innocently as I did, you say, well, a lot of this sounds kind of familiar. And then if you manage to get through all the pages of the book and you get to the back of the book, you find that every single thing in the book comes from somewhere else. It's all borrowed, or you might even say plagiarized quotations. Author Shields admits that at the advice of the lawyers of Random House, he was compelled to list all the sources of these quotations, but the book itself has nothing original of his except, you might say, the curating, the deciding what to put in, and then the confession at the end of the book of what the sources were. And the tenor of the book is totally different from Henry Adams, because what he's doing is he's challenging any notion that you could know what truth, beauty, or goodness are. He says things like, the life space of a fact is shrinking. I don't think there's time to save it, fact being presumptively true. All the best stories are true. Something can be true and untrue at the same time. It's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. So you can see this is challenging any, we might say, simple notion of what truth, beauty, and goodness are. So in the prologue to my book, I say, and I quote, I'm impelled to revisit Shields' book in light of the trinity that inspired Henry Adams. As a student of reality, I have to ask, what, if anything, in Shields' book is true? As a student of morality, I have to ask, is it good to publish a book that actually is a string of quotations initially unacknowledged as such? Remember, when you're reading the book, you don't know where these things come from. And as a student of the arts, I have to ask, is the work beautiful? So as I was writing this book, I kept these two bookends in mind, so to speak. One, truth, beauty, and goodness are obvious. There's no problem. They're all the same. They're all great. Truth, beauty, and goodness, old-fashioned ideas, don't really have any currency. We should just cut and paste whatever we want in whatever way we want. And not surprisingly, I'm trying to navigate between these two extremes. The title of the hardback is Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, Educating for the Virtues in the 21st Century. I thought that was a very 21st century title, but too many people said they didn't know what it meant. So in the paperback, which you just saw, we put in a more 21st century title, Educating for the Virtues in the Age of Truthiness and Twitter. So if somebody asks you what Gardner talked about, you can say, well, truthiness and Twitter, and if you don't know what they are, I'll tell you soon. So the book is really an attempt in the educational world to focus on very big questions. What should we teach? What should students learn? And how should this be different than 21st century? And if so, how? The work that I'm best known for, Theory of Multiple Intelligences, is almost as old as Fan. Fan is 30 years old, and this book is almost 30 years old. That must mean I'm older than 30. I wrote that book as a psychologist, and I thought I was talking to other psychologists, but in fact, most of the interest in the book has come from educators, both in this country and abroad. And as my audience became more and more populated by educators, I began to think about my own educational philosophy. And we'll skip over the multiple intelligences. And I wrote a book in the late 1990s called The Disciplined Mind. And in The Disciplined Mind, I argued that the purpose of school should be to help us learn what is true and what is false, and the academic disciplines are our source of truth and falsity, according to that book. What is beautiful and what is ugly, or kitsch? If you don't know what kitsch is, next time you stay at a hotel, look at what's on the wall, and that's what kitsch is. But beauty and ugly are how we approach arts, literature, nature. And goodness and evil, I wrote, have to do with what we know and how we act in the moral and ethical spheres. And to make this a bit more concrete, in the area of truth, I chose the theory of evolution because all of biology is based on the theory of evolution. Of course, if I go below the Mason-Dixon line, I'm not allowed to mention that, but I think it's safe here. It's probably safe with this audience anyway. In the area of beauty, I chose the music of Mozart, pretty uncontroversial example of beauty. And for dealing with good and evil, I talked about the Holocaust, which is, of course, an example of evil. Now, notice that in this book, written long before I was reminded of my school's motto, my school's epigram, I was already talking about truth, beauty, and goodness. But as I think I said in the last slide, I was very naive because, like Henry Adams, I kind of assumed that truth, beauty, and goodness were unproblematic concepts. Darwin, if evolution isn't true, what is? Beauty, if Mozart isn't beautiful, what is? The Holocaust, if genocide isn't ugly and bad, what is? But I'm no longer quite so naive because in the intervening years, the argument that I had made was under attack from two very different sources. One, philosophical, one, technological. Philosophical. Most of you have heard the word postmodern, though postmodernism is not what you think, which is an attempt to have a clever book title. You can tell me whether it's successful or not. But postmodernism is a philosophical approach which directly challenges the notion that anybody can say that they know what truth is, that anybody can declare what's good. According to postmodernism, you can't even use the word beauty, and for about 50 years within the academy, people who wrote about the arts were not even able to talk about anything that was beautiful. I don't think that you went to jail, you just wouldn't get tenure if you used the word beauty. So postmodernism attacks the whole legitimacy of using terms like this. Relativism says you can use the terms, but only you can decide what's true, beautiful, and good. You can't tell anybody else. Because among the bongo, there may be more one sense of beauty. Among the bingo, there may be a different sense of goodness. And among the bungo, there may be a wholly different way of setting truth. So postmodernism and relativism basically said, Howard, when you talked about truth, beauty, and goodness, you didn't know what you were talking about. That didn't make me feel so good. The word truthiness, some of you may not know its source. The word truthiness actually comes from Stephen Colbert. He created that word some years ago. And Stephen Colbert says, truthiness is what you describe something that comes to be treated as true because it's said over and over again, even though it has no particular warrant. There's no particular evidence for it. There's no particular proof that it's true. But if it's said over and over again, it's called truthy. And this is a quotation which came from a senior member of the Bush White House. Nowadays, people say it was Karl Rove, but I wasn't there. But this is a truthy kind of statement. It says, that's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. So the notion is you can make something truth just by saying it is. It doesn't really have any particular evidence. Does this sound a bit like the 2012 campaign? Notice I didn't point fingers at anybody. So the technological challenge is more familiar to people. It's the creation of Second Life, various kinds of virtual reality, where you can create avatars in any kind of a world that you want. Multi-user games like World of Warcraft, which involves hundreds of thousands of people who get together and form guilds and strategize and can try to gain hegemony over others. The world is composed of two kinds of people: people who belong to Facebook and liars. And soon it'll be composed of two kinds of people: people who tweet and people who pretend not to tweet but do. And what's interesting is that when I wrote The Disciplined Mind, none of these things existed. Virtual reality didn't exist. Multi-user games didn't exist. Social networks didn't exist. And instant messaging things like Twitter didn't exist. So those technological challenges are newer than the postmodern and relativist challenges, which go back some decades. So, the kinds of questions one asks in the digital world, the world of 2012, what's true? Can it be pinned down? When we can see every work of art ever done, and it can be changed, morphed, photoshopped, flickered anytime you want, does beauty matter? Does it even exist? You may not know it, because I didn't know it, but the T-shirt that Lonnie was wearing was a Jenny Holzer T-shirt. She's I guess, fair to call her a postmodern artist. What happens in the digital world to things like ownership of intellectual property, to privacy, and so on? Do they exist anymore? And how do we, in a digital world, establish that we're trustworthy, that we're credible, that when we eBay or Amazon or Craigslist or whatever, that we don't get mulked or that we don't mulk other people? And for extra credit, what does it mean to be a global cyber citizen? So, in effect, what I'm saying here is I was awakened from my slumbers by my postmodern relativistic kids and friends on the one hand, and by opening my eyes to what was happening in the world of digital media on the other. So, finally, some dry land. If you want to sleep for the next half hour, this is how I define these three terms. But don't sleep, because I'm more tired than you, and I'll fall asleep too. I'm going to argue that truth is about statements and propositions and whether or not they're accurate. It's not about images or music or experiences, or experiences that you have. It's about statements. Beauty is about experiences, primarily in the arts and nature, but a conversation can be beautiful, a walk in the park can be beautiful, a meal can be beautiful. Good is about the quality of relationships among human beings, those near to us, family, friends, neighbors, and those remote from us, those with whom we have what's often called a transactional relationship. So the rest of the talk is going to be unpacking these three definitions and saying some things about their educational implications. On to truth. You don't have to read these slides, but because I'm going to tell you what they are, but they keep me on course. One of the places we learn about truth is by going to school and learning the ways of thinking that people in different disciplines use. Scientists document truth. Historians document truth. So do mathematicians. But each of them arrives at truth in a way that's characteristic of their particular discipline. Let's compare science and history. Scientists do experiments, or they do systematic observations, and then other people do them too, and see whether they replicate them or not, whether they notice the same thing, whether there's a control condition, and so on. History is also a description of what happened, but it only happened once. You can't do experiments. You can't observe because it's in the past. And it has to do with human beings and their motivation. And in some ways, human beings haven't changed since the beginning of history. But in some other ways, human beings are very different if they lived in different eras and in different cultures. So scientists and historians both try to establish truths, but they do it in very different ways. Of course, economists, psychologists, other kinds of disciplinarians also define truths, but each of them uses the methods of that discipline, and those methods can change. So here's the key idea. Nowadays, anything that's factual, anything that's simply a factual claim you can have in your smart device. There's no point in spending time in school memorizing stuff that's easily available. When I went to school, even before Wyoming Seminary, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, many years ago, we spent the entire 7th grade memorizing the 67 counties in Pennsylvania and drawing them from memory. Now, that was a good way to spend the bar mitzvah year, but it was certainly a waste of time, since all we would have to do now would be to look it up. So what I think we need to do if we want to understand people's claims about what's true and what's not is to understand the methods which they used to go about making those claims. And of course, the point about truthiness is there were no methods used at all. People just made it up and repeated it often. So if you're looking at the methods, a truthy claim has no validity. But if somebody uses a method and you can scrutinize it and you can see they were diligent, whether they're doing science or history or mathematics, then there's some reason to think that that proposition has validity. Well, you might say, well, that's school, Howard, but I'm not worrying about school on Tuesday evening. But there are also truths in the workplace. I argue that in all kinds of work, professional, crafts, and so on, there are truths as well. These truths I call practical truths because they aren't necessarily in propositions, but they could be. So if you want to learn to be a journalist, people could tell you in words what to do, but you can also watch a journalist at work, and you can try to put it in propositions, and he or she can say, well, that's right or that's not right. Surgery, a lot of surgery is just learning how to do things and watching more skilled surgeons and trying to do it yourself. And it doesn't have to be in propositions, but it could be. First you pick up the scalpel, then you make a cut. I'm not a surgeon, obviously, but if things could be said in words. And the way we establish the truth in professions, similarly, is looking at the methods people use and see whether they accomplish what they say they're going to, whether the proposition has validity. So let's take some examples from journalism. Do you know who this is? Edward R. Murrow. He was a journalist a long time ago. How about this person? Walter Cronkite. Some people here will still remember him. He was a journalist a little less long ago. In the 60s and 70s, there were 3 television networks. At 6:30 at night, they all showed the news. There was nothing else to watch. At the end of the news hour, or half hour, Walter Cronkite said, "That's the way it is." And there was no way to show it wasn't the way it was, because that's what he told us. And there was a guy next to him named Eric Severide who explained it to you. His job was to explain what you didn't understand from Walter Cronkite. That's within my lifetime, if not yours. Now, of course, young people in particular, but many people who aren't young, trust much more twittering comedians. This is Jon Stewart. This is Stephen Colbert. And if people want to know what's going on in the world, they don't watch the evening anchors. I don't even know who they are anymore. They watch these people. That is an incredible change in how we figure out what's going on in the world just in a matter of some decades. There are also outsized personalities who say whatever comes to their mind, and they say it with conviction. And I think this is going to be my only political statement of the evening. This is a person who deals in truthiness. If you don't know who she is, that's okay. So, in the case of each of my 3 virtues, I'm going to talk about what those of us who are in education ought to be doing with reference to the virtue. At a time when all the information you could possibly ever want to look up is available at a click. What we need to do in education is to focus very sharply, like a laser, on the methods that people use, whether they're making propositions about history, about science, about math, about journalism, about law, whatever it is. Because if we know the methods that they're using, and whether if those methods hold up, then there's some reason to think that what they say has validity. But if they won't reveal the methods, can't tell you, or the methods are porous, or somebody else uses the methods and doesn't come up with the same answers, then those are reasons to be suspicious. You might say, well, how can anybody ever think about truth given all the noise that it's around? But I actually come up with a fairly, for me, optimistic conclusion. And that is, we live at a time in the history of the world where it's more likely to be able to figure out what's true than ever before. And that's because nothing is hidden anymore. Even in North Korea, it probably isn't. But certainly everywhere else in the world, the information that some people have, other people can have as well. And so with all the information out there, we can no longer say we can't find out. It's that we don't want to find out, or we don't want to take the time to do the due diligence to figure out whether the claims that are made have substance. But I believe that, let's put it this way, I'm very bullish on truth going forward. On to beauty. Back before postmodernism and relativism, we could say, oh, what a beautiful mountain, or oh, what a beautiful Grecian urn. But given what's happened in each of the art forms, and I'm going to focus on the visual arts because they're the easiest to show, any limited notion of what beauty is has just been exploded, in my view. I'm going to begin with a few paintings which would have been accepted as beautiful a century or two ago, beauty of a young child or of a Sylvan scene. But take a look at this. Many of you will know this as Monet's Water Lilies. Many, many people think this is beautiful. It's worth a lot of money. They'll spend time lining up at a museum to go see it. But when Monet first displayed his work, he wasn't even allowed to put it in the Academy. He had to put it in a special Salon des Refusés for works that had been rejected. Impressionism, when it was first, they didn't put it in the Chicago Art Museum 140 years ago. It was considered to be repulsive. But in 140 years, it's become the epitome of what people cherish. But fasten your seatbelts, because the other things that I'm going to show you haven't had 140 years yet. This is Jackson Pollock, probably the most, what shall I say, the best known and probably the most expensive artist of the last half century. Willem de Kooning, this is one of his portraits of women. Many, many people thought this was hideous, ugly, repulsive, yet now it's very cherished art. Andy Warhol, certainly an artist who's had enormous influence in the last half century. Now, this one stumped me. This is called The Deportment of the Host. It took up an entire room at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's by Matthew Barney, who is one of the most acclaimed artists under the age of 50. But when I walked through the museum with my wife, she said, "This is really beautiful." And my wife's an artist, and so I take what she says seriously. And then when I walked through the gallery with the curator of drawings from the museum, she said, "This is such a beautiful work." So what happens now? You can say, are they crazy? You can say, am I blind? Or you can say, what are they talking about? And in both cases, they talked about the texture, the whiteness, how it drew them in, how it enveloped them, how it activated all of their senses. And I said, look, I don't think it's beautiful, but at least I can understand why you said it. On the other hand, this is Anselm Kiefer, a very admired German artist, was still with us. When I first saw his work, I actually found it repulsive. I wondered, why would anybody do this? But over the course of 20 years, I've totally changed my mind. And I found this work very compelling. I would go out of my way to see it. And I would have no problem talking about it as being beautiful and powerful and so on. This is what's called conceptual art. It's by Joseph Kosuth. It's called Three Chairs. Why is it called Three Chairs? I don't think it's a pun on three cheers, but it could be. Because there's a photograph of a chair, there's a physical chair, and there's a definition of the chair. And obviously, you're supposed to try to think about what that means, just like, what does it say on your shirt? Protect me from what I want. That's what Jenny Holzer wants you to think about. Protect me from what I want. This is another conceptual art. I thought it's giving, and many of us are educators. I thought I'd bring this in. I will not make any more boring art. This is by John Baldessari. And of course, one of the things about it is each line's a little bit different, so it reminds you of a kid who's being punished for doing something wrong and has to keep writing the same lines. So what does all of this have to do with beauty? First of all, it isn't just what people do graphically or photographically. Photographically, it's now what people do digitally. This is a work of digital art. This is another one. It's actually simply the use of different websites and some kind of an internet map. And this is quite neat. You're given a wand and you can make certain configurations in the air, and then you get a piece of furniture based on the movements you've made. Anyway, if I've convinced you of nothing else, I hope I've convinced you that the sweep of art in the last 50 or 100 years blows out of the water any kind of a simple notion of what counts and what doesn't count. But is it beautiful? Well, here's the argument I want to make. And I was very touched that Bennett Reamer, who is one of the world's great experts in aesthetic education, is here. He probably hasn't heard this before, and it may well sound like a squeaky violin, but this is the argument I want to make. Beautiful experiences have three characteristics and a bonus. Number one, they're interesting. And interesting means is they capture your attention, whether it's a sound, a sight, something that you touch, even something that you eat. So they're interesting, they capture your attention. Two, there's something memorable about the form. Every day, we hear all sorts of information, we see all sorts of things, and we remember at least some of it, but there are only a few things that we remember how we heard about it or how we saw it, where we actually store the form of that message. Third, and important, disposition to revisit. There are things which are interesting, but there's nothing memorable about them. Most of the news is interesting, but we don't remember how we encountered it. There are things that we find interesting and remember the form, but either their form is quite repulsive and we don't want to see it again. That's how I felt about some of the art that I showed you. Or it's memorable, but we kind of figure we've stored it, we don't have to visit it again. So it's those things that are interesting and have memorable form, and we want to visit them again. That's what I consider to be beauty in our time. And the reward you get, but it's not a requirement, is a little neurotransmitter which gives you a pleasant tingle or tinkle so that you may want to repeat the experience again. So armed with those criteria, interest, memorable in form, and disposition to revisit, let me run through the same things again. And you can ask yourself, interesting, memorable, etc. Remember, though, the Jackson Pollocks are huge. They're almost as big as that screen, whereas, in a book, they're going to look tiny. De Kooning, interesting, memorable. Probably wouldn't want to revisit the first time, but maybe when you keep revisiting it, you'd have a different view. the Warhol, the Portrait of a Host, Kiefer, Three Chairs. I bet you'll remember Three Chairs. Do you want to see it again? Maybe not. So, education. What I think we should do as educators and as parents is help young people or help ourselves collect our beautiful experiences. I call these portfolios. And the idea is if you find something, again, it doesn't have to be a work of art, it could be nature or a person you meet or just an adventure you have, which is interesting, memorable form, and you want to visit again, put it in your portfolio. Every 5-year-old and every 10-year-old has things which he or she likes, and that's great. But life would be dull if it never changed. I mean, every 7-year-old in this country probably wants to go to McDonald's for every meal. And some of us who are 70 still want to go to McDonald's, but it'd be pretty boring if that's all we wanted to do. We're lucky enough in our society to be exposed to different foods, and hopefully that expands our notion of the kinds of meals we would like to have. I think we should think the same way about our beautiful experiences. We should collect them, we should reflect on them. We can collect them physically, virtually, or in our heads, and we should note the ways that they change and why. But there's one catch, and this catch comes from some work which my own teacher, Nelson Goodman, did many years ago. And the idea is, if you cherish something, you need to be able to indicate how it's different from something else which is in the same category. Why is that important? Because there needs to be a reason why you think something is beautiful and something else is not. So I'm going to make it concrete. Who's this? Who's this? Will the real Mona Lisa please stand up? If you cherish Mona Lisa, as many people do, you should be able to look at these two and say what the difference is. And why is that important? Because we don't want to admire something just because somebody else does. We don't want to admire something just because it's worth a lot of money. We need to be able to see or hear the difference between the experience which we cherish and the one which we're just doing because somebody else tells us to do it. So I'm going to give you a little visual fun here. Cézanne and Pissarro were two very famous artists, and many people like one and not the other, but what's interesting is they often painted the same thing. So if you say you like Cézanne and not Pissarro, or vice versa, you should be able to see the differences. Here's two paintings quite similar, one by Cézanne, one by Pissarro. I'm not going to tell you which is which because I don't remember. This is interesting. One of them is by Helen Frankenthaler. It's worth millions. The other is by a 4-year-old. Similarly, one's by Jackson Pollock. The other is by a 4-year-old. One of them is by, I think, Hans Hofmann, and the other is by a kid. Now, what's actually interesting is my wife, Ellen Winter, whom I mentioned, is not only an artist, she's a psychologist. You know, when people first did abstract expressionism, you know what everybody said? Oh, a 4-year-old could do that. Well, she's actually done a study that shows that even kids can see the difference between these two, or these two, or these two. And you want to know why? So do I. No. Young people, like older people, can see which work required craft and which didn't. And that's really what underlies any art. I mean, Jackson Pollock, for someone who knows nothing, looks like he's just spraying paint. But of course, he knew exactly what he was doing. And I've studied Pollock enough to know the art is very fractal. If you look at a tiny area and then you look at larger areas, you see the same whirling patterns. So these are crafty. They're not simply random shots. You can even do it with art from another culture. These are Chinese ink and brush paintings. The one on the right is by a kid and the other one is by a famous artist. So, I argued earlier that truth is convergent, and we should try to figure out what's true by focusing on the methods that people use. Beauty is wonderful. There's no reason in the world why any two people have to admire the same things as beautiful. Everybody can have their own portfolio, and maybe everybody should have their own portfolio. And of course, what the digital world enables us now is for each of us to examine countless works in any medium, not that it's the same as really going to a concert or really seeing Monet, and we can put together what we like and why. And I think that's, again, an upbeat kind of message. On to the good. This is going to be a little bit heavier lifting because good is tough. We've been interested in our work. I'm now working with many colleagues on this, and what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a good worker, and what it means to be a good citizen. And we've done this as part of what we call the Good Work Project, which I'll mention in passing. To invade this territory of the good, remember I said good has to do with relations among people, I need to introduce the distinction which I make in this book between neighborly morality and the ethics of roles. Neighborly morality, as the name indicates, is about how do we deal with people whom we know well, people whom we see every day, friends, family, neighbors, people who live on the block, so to speak. My argument is we have been prepared as human beings for millennia to know how to relate to people right near us. And that's what the Golden Rule is about. Do unto others as the neighbors should do unto you, or don't do unto others as you don't want them to do to you. And the Ten Commandments. When I looked at the Ten Commandments, I realized the Ten Commandments are really about your neighbors. Don't steal from them, don't kill them, don't commit adultery, don't disrespect them, don't lie to them. It's what you do with people whom you see every day, the 150 people whom we've evolved as a species to know well. We live in a very complex, differentiated labor world. People have many, many different roles in their occupations. You can be an engineer, doctor, lawyer, teacher, artist, architect, etc. And we also are citizens of our community, of our state, of our nation, of the world. And we need to know how to behave in those roles. Many of these are quite transactional. They're with people who we don't know except at work. We may not even know them first face to face. I deal with dozens of people who I've never met just on the internet. And so the ethics of roles is how do we behave in those roles, which, I argue, you can't look it up. You can't go to the Bible and know what decision you should make as a journalist or what decision you should make as a lawyer. This doesn't mean the Bible is irrelevant, but there are all kinds of issues which come up every day which aren't settled there. Similarly, the notion of being a member of a tribe or community is very old, but citizen is not. There were citizens in Greece. They were males who owned property. But our modern notion of citizenship only comes out of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and still in much of the world, there is really not really a developed notion of citizenship. And so what it means to be a good citizen, again, is not something that you can look up in the Bible in the Ten Commandments. It requires a lot of knowledge and reflection and trying to deal with complex issues that arise at the workplace or in the voting booth. As I started to mention, with Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Bill Damon. Bill Damon has been a fan speaker. We're still trying to get Mike Csikszentmihalyi. We've been studying what good work is for many years. And I'll tell you what it is after many years. Good work is a combination of three features. Let's make it concrete. Let's talk about a good worker, a good teacher. A good teacher is excellent. He or she knows his or her subject. A good teacher is engaged, meaning he or she cares about the work, looks forward to it, looks forward to Monday, doesn't dread it, enjoys being with students, enjoys keeping up. And the good worker is ethical. Teachers and other professionals run into problems all the time which are complicated, which we can't look up. Every year I teach, new ethical dilemmas come up. I try to talk to other people. I try to reflect on my own experience, but I don't go try to look it up in the Book of Solomon because the answer isn't there. Now, if you look at this figure, it's a triple helix. Now, all of you know about the double helix in DNA. The triple helix is ENA. And that means if you want to be a good worker, you have to be excellent and engaged and ethical. There are people who are excellent but who are no longer engaged. There are people who are engaged but don't know too much, don't know enough. And the people who are excellent and engaged but are unethical. We call them crooks. We say they participate in compromised work. There's a lot of it around. So the challenge of being a good worker, of combining the three E's, is a very profound one. And even though we didn't realize it when we began our study, the same three E's apply to the citizen. The good citizen knows the rules, knows the laws, is informed. Number two, cares, bothers to vote, speaks up, talks politics, may run for office, may play some other role in a campaign. And the good citizen is ethical. He or she doesn't just try to promote his or her own self-interest. He or she thinks about what's better for the community, which can be as small as a town or as large as the European Union or indeed the planet. I mean, people like Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King didn't say what's good for my city. They thought about much larger entities. So the good person, how you deal with people around you, I call that neighborly morality. And again, it's not that everybody achieves this, but it's pretty clear what it means to be a good neighbor and what it means to be a bad neighbor. But to think about what it means to be a good worker or a good citizen means trying to deal with things which come up, which are complicated, you can't look them up, and particularly when the world is changing quickly, when, for example, it's so easy to pass information around, what does that mean when you're dealing with, as a teacher, grading homework, things like that? So we did a study about, well, it was published in 2004, so it was done 10 years ago, of good work in young people. And this was a very important study for us because the results were so surprising that it actually changed what my colleagues and I do. What we did was we interviewed young people, roughly from the ages of 15 to 30, and these were so-called the best and the brightest. These were kids who were already achieving, already accomplished, had a very bright future. What did we discover when we talked with them about good work? They admired people who were ethical. They admired people who did the right thing. And many of them really tried to do the right thing. They really tried to be good workers, including excellence, engagement, and ethics. But over and over again, we heard from these young people 10 years ago that they wanted to be successful, they wanted to have wealth, they wanted to be famous, some wanted one more than the others, and they were bent upon those ends. And they said, our peers are cutting corners. They're not being ethical. They're not playing by the rules. And we're damned, they said, if we're going to let those other people get what we want. So what we heard over and over again from these young people was someday when we get to be rich, famous, successful, etc., then we'll be ethical. We'll hire ethical people, we'll set a good example. But for now, they told us, we're going to cut corners and we want to be allowed to cut corners. And they were telling this. It wasn't like we were spying on them, so we can assume they weren't trying to make themselves look worse than they were. So, in hearing about this, I was reminded of what St. Augustine once said. He was a classmate of mine. And St. Augustine said, "O Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." And, I'm being a little bit amusing about this. But in fact, we found this very upsetting because this was, of course, our kids. And it's not our kids' fault. It's the fault of the older people in the society that kids are raised believing that ethics is something you can put off till tomorrow. So on August 30th of this year, I got a phone call, an email actually, from the editor of the Harvard magazine, and he said, "Howard, you need to know about this." And as many of you know, it was reported later that day that in a large course at Harvard, where I've been for over 50 years, half the kids in the class were accused of cheating. And we now call this the Harvard cheating scandal of 2012. Within a half an hour, I had written an op-ed about this event. I sent it to the New York Times. To their credit, they immediately rejected it. So I then sent it to the Washington Post, which did print it. But the first line in the editorial is what I want to tell you about today. I said, when I heard of the cheating scandal at Harvard, I was shocked, but I was not surprised. I was shocked because I think anybody in a school, whether it's New Trier or Stuyvesant or Yale or wherever, where half the kids in the class cheat, that should be a source of shock, particularly because you don't even know whether there are more kids who cheated. I'm not going to say here I know that every kid who cheated, who's accused, is guilty. That hasn't been decided yet, but clearly, when there's smoke, there's fire. But I realized, and this is why I wrote the op-ed, I wasn't surprised at all, because 10 years ago, we'd been hearing from kids over and over again, we're going to do what it takes to succeed. And this is a lesson I've taken from the Harvard example. The reason I mentioned Stuyvesant is a large high school in New York, which just about the same time had a huge cheating scandal unleashed, which involved vast numbers of students there. And again, it's an exam school. Kids go on to very prestigious colleges. And so it's quite shocking to learn about this. So when I say my life's been changed, in what way? Since 2004, and actually some of this work we've done in conjunction with New Trier, we've been trying to give away good work. And we've done this by creating a curriculum in journalism, by developing something called a toolkit, which is being used in secondary schools and colleges, and more recently actually in elementary schools, graduate courses, which I've taught, reflection sessions at colleges, and we're actually having a conference, if anybody's interested, at an independent school outside Boston in March of this year on what we've been trying to do to help, as it were, strengthen the ethical muscle of our young people, who are our future. So, Lonnie already gave you an advanced organizer on this. I think what we in education should do, and in various ways I've been trying to do this at my own school, is we should create common spaces. Traditionally, the commons was a field where cattle grazed, and everybody grazed their cattle there. But if everybody left their cattle there as much as the cattle wanted, there'd be no nurturant field or meadow there the next year. It would have to be lie fallow. And so everybody has to stint a bit if the commons is to survive. A commons in an education world is an area which can be physical, and I think it's great if it is, but it can also be virtual, where people talk about dilemmas that they're facing, try to get help and advice, admit when things didn't go well, but not in a finger-pointing way, and say, what can we do to make it better? And things like the cheating scandal at Harvard or at Stuyvesant, or my friend Chuck Lewis and I here are dealing with a different kind of upset in another institution, These can be wake-up calls where people who care about the institution can get together and figure out how to try to do a better job. So I'm getting to the conclusion. I see I've coined a new word in Chinese here, but that's an accident. The book does have a couple of villains. One is evolutionary psychology, which tries to explain everything by human evolutionary history. I think, for example, neighborly morality can well be explained by evolution, but the ethics of roles, evolution is no real help. And I like to think that people can be rational sometimes, and this was the typo, that markets can be beneficial, but I don't think we should assume that either of those things is necessarily true. So who are the heroes? The heroes, as of today, is the notion of human agency. Human beings can make a difference. Individuals who try to do the right thing, groups that try to do the right thing. Many of you will know the famous quotation from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. She said, "Never condemn a small group of people who get together to discuss something new. Nothing important in the world has ever happened any other way." And the reason that I am unhappy with evolutionary psychology and rational choice economics is basically they say people are a certain way and there's nothing we can do about it. And what I'd like to think is people can be different than they are, and most of the wonderful things in the world happen because people go against the grain, so to speak, and try to do better than they've done before. And that's what I think institutions need to do when they run into problems, is figure how they can regroup, and make a positive difference. I'm a creature of the Enlightenment. I imagine most people are as well here. Enlightenment means belief in progress, reason, democratic processes. But the problem with the Enlightenment is it was the product of a half a dozen European males living in the 18th century in France, England, Scotland. That's great. But I think if we want to have a notion of good, which isn't simply what certain people in a certain place at a certain time think, we need to have a more universal, a more ecumenical view of the good. And I think the Enlightenment of the 21st century, as difficult as it will be to achieve, needs to be based upon the best ideas in our major civilizations, not just the ones we know the best, as well as smaller societies which have had an understanding of sustainability, which the larger societies, including ours, have not understood at all, a sense of what it takes to keep the commons nourished from one generation to the other. So, what should we teach and learn? How is it different in our time? I think that's what I was talking about for the last hour. But just to remind you in Twitter length what we've done, I talked about the traditional virtues of truth, beauty, and goodness as Henry Adams saw them all in one neat package. Then the two threats, you could call them challenges, you could even call them opportunities, but they are new. One is the postmodern critique, which says, who do you think you are talking about these old-fashioned ideas? And then the new threat or challenge, the digital media, where everything can be changed, altered, everything is all there, and it can be pushed in any way. And then I gave you my way of essentially simplifying the virtues. Truth is about statements and propositions. Some are true, some are false. Some are temporarily indeterminate, like who's going to win the election, and some are always indeterminate. My wife and I have stopped arguing about free will because we're never going to figure out who's right and who's wrong. You can guess which position each of us take if you want. Beauty is about experiences, typically art and nature, but it can be about any experience which is interesting, memorable form, and we want to have it again. Goodness is about how we relate to people, folks on the block whom we see every day, friends and relatives, and those people whom we encounter at the workplace because of our roles or in the polis because of our roles as citizens. I describe the educational methods, the educational solutions. When it comes to truth, we really need to focus on what is the evidence, what is the methods that people used to make the assertions that they did. When it comes to experiences, let's help people gather, reflect, explain, wallow in, and add to the experiences which are interesting, memorable, and worth revisiting. And then in the area of goodness, especially goodness which we can't simply do what evolution in the Bible told us to do, establishing commons where we can really grapple with difficult issues and try to do better than we did last time. So 3 books: Henry Adams, No Problem; David Shields, also No Problem, but No Solution; and then my book with the new paperback title. Thank you.
At the request of Dr. Gardner, the question and answer session was not recorded. Thank you for listening to this podcast from Family Action Network in New Trier High School. More information about this program is available at www.familyactionnetwork.net. Production by Chuck Jameson. Copyright 2012. All rights reserved. Family Action Network.